Hi, today's the first day of what will be an interesting project. I have two NuTone Model 2016 master stations in for repair. These were both sent in by the same fella. What he wants is for them to be repaired and rebuilt so they're both fully functional, as close to brand new as we can make them. There will be some challenges with this. Just briefly, the obvious things are this one appears to be in pretty good shape cosmetically. However, the dial glass here is broken and missing, so that has to be dealt with. This one back here is not in as good a condition because while the dial glass is intact, one of the room control switches here is broken. The little black knob is missing. The bottom of the unit is all kind of smashed and bent in. I don't know whether that's going to be able to be straightened out or if we need to source a replacement faceplate for them. The faceplates on models like this are made out of reasonably thin, not super thin, not Pepsi can thin, but thin enough aluminum. And then they were stamped out, I assume, and they have this copper anodized coating on it. So when they get bent like this, or bent in any way, the problem with them is that the aluminum, when it bends, it stretches, and when you try to bend it back, it can be wavy because now it's bigger than it used to be. So that's an issue also. One of the other things about these two units are, this one was made in August of 1958, and this one was made in February of 1961. So these represent sort of the beginning and end of production for 2016s. The way it's commonly looked at is the very first model of NuTone Intercom, the 2011-2012, were made in 1957 and 1958. And then the 2015-2016s came out in 1959, and all of those early tube models, they were in production and available probably through sometime the early or mid 1961, maybe through almost 1962, and then they were replaced by newer and different models. So we have two units that span the production life of 2016s. These models are, regardless of when they were made, are very challenging to repair. They use point-to-point wiring, and we have another video where I sort of go over some of that, and I'll put one of those pop-ups up here that you can go look at that video if you're interested in what that means. What it means for me is they're hard and difficult to work on. They have a very small chassis area, and everything is point-to-point. No circuit boards or anything like that. Every component is soldered one end and the other to some other connection underneath the chassis, and the chassis is rather small. If I put my hand here, I can easily cover half the chassis with one hand. So it's not very big. Everything's really squeezed into there. That's the way they were made, and that makes them challenging to work on, along with lots of other things, because basically they're just old. The other thing that will be interesting about this is that whenever you have two of the same units and they're going back to the same customer, there's a natural inclination by the customer to compare this one to this one and this one to that one. Because for the average person, they're going to make an assumption that they both should be exactly the same. And that isn't always the case, especially because this one's 1958, which is right at the beginning of the production, and this is 1961 towards the end of the production. And these are, while they're both 2016s, these are actually somewhat different models. And if you fast forwarded a decade or so in the line of NuTone intercoms, this one would have been called a 2016, and this one probably would have been called a 2016A. Because they are somewhat different models, because there were revisions and changes that were made to them. And that was because, as with all things, you can design and engineer and test a model, but until you let it out into the real world, you don't really know all the things that are going to happen and all the problems that could occur or the situations that come up when they're installed in people's houses. There are a raft of service bulletins about these models. In some cases, there was a service bulletin almost every month about something as changes were made, and there were changes made in the production. A couple years after this one came out, there were some fairly substantial changes made to address problems that came up. Previously, I actually did a pair of units for another customer. They were a pair of 2057s, and they were actually done for a subscriber to this YouTube channel. His name is Anthony. Those two 2057s, and there is a video about those, and I can put another pop-up up here if you want to go see what that's about. One was a very early one, and one was sort of a mid-production one. And in the end, one of them, and I don't remember which one off the top of my head, one of them, the reception on the FM radio was substantially better than on the other one. And that's just the character of those units. And those are the kind of things that happen, and I made it very clear to them that that's just the way it is. They're two separate units. They each have their own personalities. There wasn't anything wrong with either one of them. It's just the way they worked. Those are the kind of things you have to be really clear with on people, because their expectations might be different than what the final outcome will be. So one of the things I like to do before we start a project like this is, of course, I have my official NuTone service manual. This is actually the original service manual for 2016. This was printed in April of 1958, so it's closely associated with this one back here because it's an early one. NuTone was not real big on updating service manuals on a very regular basis. There may be one schematic update that I have in a binder for this model that shows some of the changes that happened a couple years later. But what they were fairly good about doing was issuing service bulletins. And you have to remember, this is in the earliest days of NuTone service centers. NuTone service centers really didn't exist until like 1956, 1957. They were building a network of guys like me throughout the country who could go out and work on NuTone products in people's homes and deal with problems and issues that came up on new installations for new products. These service bulletins give you some insight into the things that were going on and the changes and problems that were occurring, and it helps make it easier to relate to units like these when you're repairing them, because you have to remember, this one was made before I was born, and this one was made just a few years later. One of the disadvantages that I've always felt is that on either one of these, I've never seen a brand new one. All of the ones I've ever seen are broken. So you don't know by experience what and how much to expect from them. There's a certain standard that you assume they were manufactured to. However, when you read through the service bulletins, you realize that you can't apply the standards from today, from 2022, to something that was designed in 1958, because it's not the same. These service bulletins are important because reading them gives you some insight and makes it easier to relate to the kinds of problems and issues that were going on with units like these when they were still relatively new. While I'm not going to read all of these, it is an important piece of information to have, or a knowledge base to have. One of the interesting things, like in this service bulletin, they talk about, this is from September 1960, so apparently in January of 1960 they made a change from this one to this one by changing the output tube for the amplifier in the set. And the reason that they did that was because the output tube in this one, which is a 50C5, apparently, and they don't come out and say it exactly, but they sort of hint around at it, the tube in this one probably used more current than the one they changed to in this, and the use of the greater amount of current probably dropped the voltage throughout the set entirely, and that created problems with how well the FM tuner worked in the set. And why was that an issue? Well, it says here, I will read this part. This change will result in assurance FM reception in low line voltage areas, improved sensitivity, and maximum tube life. So apparently in the late 1950s, there was issues with the line voltage for the electrical grid in areas of the country. I did a little bit of looking into it because I thought that was kind of interesting. And it turns out, I read an article, which I believe this is sort of part of the electrifying of rural America thing. In 1940, only 10% of rural communities throughout the United States had electricity, which I find interesting and kind of surprising. Big cities had electricity and so forth, but a lot of electricity generation, it wasn't like a nationwide power grid or anything that we have sort of today. It was a lot of local power generation, and the line voltage and so forth varied a lot from area to area, and sets like this are susceptible to that. So that was kind of an issue. It's kind of interesting also that today we have all kinds of power grid problems because the power grid is old, not because the generation isn't standardized, but line voltages vary. So that was an issue. And then we also have a service bulletin which applies to these two, which basically talks about how the speaker cone in this unit tended to have problems because these units, when they're mounted in the wall, seal up fairly tightly. There is not a lot of ventilation, and according to this bulletin, Underwriters Laboratory, UL for all you folks, do not permit ventilation holes in the rough-in box or slots or opening in the master unit front panel. Vacuum tube sets generate a fair amount of heat. So it says the previous speaker was found to be affected by temperature change, and after 30 to 60 minutes of operation, internal heat of the master would warp the speaker cone, causing distorted and garbled sound. So the speaker cone was changed to a different model that wouldn't be affected by the heat. So this one actually has the early speaker in it, and this one actually has the later speaker in it. Are we going to be able to do anything about that? Probably not, because that was like in October of 1960 and there's no speaker cones anymore. So that was an issue. And then this one, this service bulletin is from November of 1960. And basically what they're talking about in this one, which I also find interesting because this is something that all NuTone service guys sort of have dealt with over the years, is about AC and DC, mostly AC hum on systems. And I assume it was because people complained. And it actually talks about things that you can sort of try to make sure are assembled correctly under the chassis, the way the wires are run, and so on and so on and so on. And then it kind of gives you this testing procedure that you can go out to a customer's house and you take your vacuum tube voltmeter with you. It would have been your old Simpson. I think in 1960 it would have been like a Model 260 or something like that. I used to have one of those. And how you could hook it up to this, to the audio output of the master station, and measure the millivolts of it and see if it's within the acceptable range of hum on a system. The reason that you would do that wouldn't be to solve the hum. It would be mostly, I think, it's sort of part of the NuTone dog and pony show. You have a customer, they have one of these, it's newly installed, someone in the house is complaining about it has some background hum, and you go out there and you make sure the installation is done correctly and so forth, and then you go to your truck and you get your vacuum tube voltmeter and you open up the unit and you hook it up and you measure it and you say, well, you see, ma'am, what the meter says here, it measures under 10 millivolts, which is what NuTone considers to be an acceptable level of hum, and that's the way these units are, and look at the time, I gotta go. So it's sort of a workaround to get past the customer complaint, and then if there's any more complaints about it from that customer, I guess you would refer them to the factory and they would have to try to deal with it. And then this last service bulletin I have talks about changes that you can make to the unit because of the output tube change, and it's sort of a summary of different things that were covered in other service bulletins. Unfortunately, the service bulletins I have only are number 16 through, I guess it's like number 21, because there were service bulletins about other things also. The service bulletins, I assume there were service bulletins 1 through 15, which I don't have copies of. These were given to me when I became a service center. It was part of the packet that they send you to build a library of information about the products they expect you to work on, but it didn't include any more than this, so maybe they didn't have copies to send out anymore, or they were lost to time or something like that. So this will be an interesting multi-part project. I'm going to get started on these. I've already ordered tubes for them, for the tubes that were bad, and other miscellaneous parts. It's going to be a little hard to make a detailed video about working on these because, as I showed earlier, the chassis are really small and you put your hands in the way when you're working on stuff and you really can't see a lot. So I have to figure out how to cover some of it, so at least there'll be some information, but it won't really be a step-by-step or a great detailed video because it's just too hard to do. I hope you found this interesting, and maybe for someone it will be helpful. If it is, give it a thumbs up on YouTube because that helps us just a little bit. There'll be a banner right here that shows you how to subscribe. Go to our YouTube homepage, click on the bell, and when you click on the bell, click on it to receive all notifications, and every time we post a new video, you get a notification and you can watch it. That's all for today. See you on the next video.